we've already talked a little bit about how to capture the stars, the Milky Way, the night sky. We've talked a little bit about the theory and everything you're going to need to know to be able to capture it. But let's jump right into the technical aspect. We're going to start a little bit simple, just the basic settings of how to capture the night sky. This is a really simple shot. We're right around Lake Tekapo, and there's 3 pine trees here, and I've angled the camera up at 14mm to frame the pine trees with a little bit of the Milky Way coming out of the top. So first of all, the biggest challenge is that I can't see anything because it's pitch black. I could tell there were pine trees here because I was shining my flashlight around. So what I was able to do is shine my high-powered flashlight on the trees and use that as a staple for my composition and also an area to focus on. If the trees wouldn't have been there, I would have just been outside shooting a flat horizon in the night sky. The best practice is to set the focus to infinite. It's a little irritating that every lens has a slightly different infinite point. On a lot of the Nikon and Canon lenses, Tamron lenses, they actually go past infinite, which is kind of strange to me. I don't understand how you can have infinity plus 1 on a lens. Zeiss lenses go to infinite and stop right at the infinite point, so it's really easy to set. So each lens is a little bit different. In fact, if you have a 14-24 lens and your buddy has one, your infinite point's going to be slightly different than theirs. So it's good practice to test to figure out exactly what the threshold is on your particular lens. So if you're not sure, you're out here in the night sky and you have not figured out what your infinite point actually is, one thing that you can do is set it to what you think is infinite, take a shot, zoom in, see if it's blurry, twist it a little bit, see if it gets better or worse, twist it the other way, see if it gets better or worse. That's the way that you can get as sharp of an image as possible. Another thing that you can do, if you have a buddy with you, have them run out about 30 yards with a flashlight, shine it right at your camera and use that point of light to focus on. So this is going to be pretty straightforward. Let's talk about camera settings. It's pitch black out here. I have a few street lights in the background and some cars driving by, so that's going to create a nice little glow. But generally for full dark night sky, I'm using the 14-24, which is an f2.8 lens. So I'm going to take advantage of that, leave it on f2.8. I'm going to turn the ISO up to 1600. And since I'm shooting at 14mm, I'm going to go for a 30-second exposure. Now I shot using a 30-second exposure because according to the 500 rule, remember the 500 rule, if we take 500 and divide our millimeter into 500, we get the time that we can shoot before the stars start to leave an impact and a trail. So this looks pretty good. I like it. I actually like some of the lights underneath the trees there on the horizon. I think that adds a little bit of an element to it. There's also a little bit of ambient light coming from the town back there that's illuminating the trees so slightly that they look like they've been light painted just a hair. And I actually see some of the detail of the Milky Way right above in the frame. It actually is a better shot than I thought it was going to be. I thought this was just going to be a simple explanation, but I kind of like the composition. I like the way it's coming out. So when I talk about astrophotography in complete darkness at f2.8, I like to work somewhere between 1600 and 3200 ISO. Now with 1600, it's slightly underexposed. I could probably go up to 3200, but what is that going to do? It's going to cause a lot more grain. Right now I'm shooting with the Nikon D810, which has improved over the Nikon D800 to give us an extra stop of quality, which is really nice. So I know that I can shoot at 1600 ISO and get a fairly clean image in the sky. If I go up to 3200, it's still going to be usable, but if I go up to 6400, I just find it too grainy and unusable. So I always try to use the lowest ISO possible. Now that's really going to be determined based on how much ambient light is around, if we're doing any light painting, and in this case, there is a town. Even though they have really soft lights, it's still causing some illumination on the scene. So I'm able to get away with an ISO of 1600 as opposed to 3200. But every situation you get in, sometimes it's going to be an ISO of 2000 or 2500 or even 3200. Somewhere between those settings seems to be a sweet spot. Everything that I've been doing so far has been with the f2.8 14-24. That's my fastest and widest lens. Now new lenses are coming out all the time that are even faster. So if you can get something that's like 18mm at f1.4 or 1.8, that's an entire stop faster, which means that you can have a lower ISO rating. So the faster the glass, the better your ISO and the higher quality your star photography is going to come out. A lot of glass out there right now has an f4 rating, so 16 to 35, like the one I use all the time is an f4. F4 kills me with astrophotography because the lowest ISO setting I'm able to do is 3200. So it immediately puts it between 3200 and 6400, which is just outside of my comfort zone. So if you're gonna get serious about astrophotography, an f2.8 or lower lens is pretty mandatory. So while this is a pretty simple example, it's also a pretty fun example, and it's the first time that we've really shot the night sky. So I'm really excited to start getting into this section, getting more complex, harder shots that we can work on, and just getting some really cool stuff with astrophotography. Again, this is a really simple image, but it's really fun. Let's take it into Photoshop, see how we can accentuate the stars, add contrast in the scene while mitigating some of the noise from the high ISO. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. I'm really excited today because we're going to start learning about astrophotography. So sometimes it's nice to say that we've actually saved the best for last. This is one of my favorite things to do. With my portfolio a few years ago, I decided to start adding the night sky not only to landscapes in different places like this where we went in New Zealand, but also to old European cities or anything I could think of to where I could potentially capture enough stars or star trails in the sky. So today we're going to go over a very basic scene. You guys saw the lesson. We found kind of a cool little group of trees near the Church of the Good Shepherd, and we were able to just point the camera at the sky and capture the Milky Way. So today we're going to go over the basics of editing, noise reduction, and some basic things like that. So we're ready to dive right into some more complicated scenes. But before I get started, I just want to point out that my configuration here with my Wacom Intuos has changed, as well as my keyboard. I've swapped my small Intuos tablet with a medium Intuos tablet, which actually gives me more control because my gestures change. Instead of just a flick of the wrist to get across the screen, I have to move a little bit more. So it allows me to do more painting with broader strokes, which is really nice. I've also put the keyboard up here. So this is what I'd recommend if you guys are working at home on an iMac or a 27-inch monitor, something around this size. This is the perfect size to work. So the small is my favorite tablet to work alongside of a laptop or a 15, 17-inch monitor, but with a 27 like this works really well. So I highly recommend it. The other thing that I've done here, and if you take a look at the Wacom tablet tools, is if I just put my finger lightly over one of these buttons, you'll see that I've set some custom keys. So down here on the bottom, these 4 buttons I've actually set to be spacebar, select, zoom, and the brush tool in Photoshop. And then I also have command and option up here. So I don't have to reach all the way up to the keyboard if I don't want to. I can use any of these express keys. I've also set my radial menus here. You can see if I press the button for radial menu, I've set some very common things I use in Photoshop. So I'm going to try to use some of these too, or not. It's really easy if you're using a tablet like this, the large one or the medium one. It's kind of nice to have it right in front of you with the keyboard up here. So I wanted to point that out here. Showing the express menu, when I highlight the keys, I'm going to go ahead and hide that so you guys don't have to see that every time I use one of the express keys. So let's go ahead and get started editing this image. So here's what we shot. We have those 3 trees, just pointed it right at the sky. You can see the EXIF data right here. We got 1600 ISO, 30 seconds, f2.8 at 14 millimeter. Remember, it was very hard to focus on anything, so we had spotlight on the trees so that we could get the focus locked in on the foreground here, which at 14 millimeters, something that far away, it's definitely set to infinite already, so we got everything as in focus as it possibly could be and as sharp as it possibly could be using f2.8. But let's go ahead. First thing that we need to do, obviously, is talk about the distortion, which is already set to 100%, and then the light fall off. So you can see there's an extraordinary amount of vignetting associated with that f2.8. Now, as far as the sharpness fall off, since it's the sky here and just this grass, I'm not going to worry about it this time, though I love it for most other things, a lot of the cityscape stuff. Let's move right on to the color correction, and here you can see that this is pretty properly balanced. It's funny when we start looking at the histograms for night sky scenes, there is nothing here in the midtones and the highlights. It's all basically in the shadows. This little spike here on the right, that little bit of red, makes up for these blown out areas. And you can see I have that toggled here. The rest of it, we're just going to have to make small adjustments. So what I'm actually going to do is, in this case, I like the highlights where they are, but I'm going to change the shadows. I'm just going to boost that just a little bit. And then instead of, I can't really recover the highlights here, and instead of boosting the shadows too much, what I'm actually going to do is just clamp the highlights here using the levels. And I can do that just by doing this. And you can see as I start to do that, it's going to brighten up the whole scene. So it's just going to kind of clamp these levels up. So that's a little bit different when we do it this way, and you can see it's going to be a little bit different than the shadows because what we're actually doing is affecting the overall curve itself. So the shadows does a little bit with the recovery, where this is actually clamping the levels. So we don't do that all the time, but in this case I like the way that it looks, and I feel like it's really going to give us the best ability to do color corrections, where this starts to make everything look a little bit washed out as a comparison. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and get this into Photoshop and take it to the next level. I'll go ahead and export the variants as usual. We've been doing that a lot. So as usual, I've already brought in the original exposure here. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and stack this one up. So I'll copy here and we'll paste it on top, and we'll call this the adjusted raw. And down here, instead of background, we'll go ahead and rename that to the original raw. Perfect. I'll hit save in the background because, let's face it, Photoshop never crashes. What I want to do now, I want to show you guys an option. And we've been using Capture One this entire tutorial, and I did that for a couple reasons. One, I actually prefer it for perfect color and sharpness. But the other reason is I really wanted to teach you guys something new. I'm aware that 80% of the photography community is actually using Adobe products and Adobe Lightroom as opposed to Capture One. And as I explained in the section in the intro when I talked a little bit about the raw processing, it doesn't really matter necessarily what you're using, but I wanted to show you guys as true to what my actual workflow is. But there's something else that we can actually access inside of Photoshop, which is really nice. We can actually access the Camera Raw filter, which will give us the ability to use the Camera Raw corrections inside of Photoshop without using a raw file. So this is actually pretty nice. So here's where we can do some other things here to further enhance it. Well, Photoshop has some great tools from using curves, color, hue saturation, contrast, vibrance, different things like that. But this is definitely a complete set of different color corrections. So let's make first some tweaks to the overall luminosity of this. And I'm going to do that first by pulling up the highlights a little bit. So I want to really pop those stars. I want to pull the whites up to do about the same thing, maybe also about 40. And you can see how those stars just really start to pop out of the sky here. And I'm also going to do one other thing. So we've made some changes here to brighten up the sky, but I'm also going to go all the way under the effects panel here. And I'm going to use a slider called Dehaze. And Dehaze is something that Adobe has added into its Adobe Camera Raw very recently, really only a few weeks ago when we started recording this. And it gives us the ability to add contrast, but what it does is it tries to find varying levels of depth. So it recognizes atmospheric perspective. And what we started to notice here is it actually does a lot to actually enhance the Milky Way. So check this out. So you can see we're actually getting a very dramatic and enhanced Milky Way just by sliding this over a little bit. So I might be able to go just kick it up a little bit just to about 25, and I might be able to get something that's pretty nice. So let's go ahead and say OK, and we'll apply it. So as you can see, we have a pretty nice effect from just the Camera Raw filter. It gave us the ability to get a nice result, and actually if we zoom in just a hair, you can see that it gave us some contrast around the trees. It popped the vibrance a little bit. I'm not too worried about these areas that are blown out down here. This was really meant to be kind of a sample shot. But right now, our biggest challenge in this isn't the color correction itself. It's really going to be the noise factor. And I want to be able to remove as much noise from the sky as possible. But before I do that, I really wanted to focus the attention of this scene on this beautiful nightscape, not so much the foreground here. So by doing that Camera Raw filter, I've managed to bring back some of the details in the ground here, but I don't want all those details there. So what I'm going to do first is add a mask and select the gradient tool here. So we'll select the gradient tool. And what I'm going to do is actually just mask this out so we get the effect pretty much from here to here only. So it's just the sky. But what I'm also going to do is say that I want 50% of the effect, or 50-ish 50% of the effect on the ground. And I'm going to do that by double-clicking on the mask and changing the density. So you can see at 100% I lose it, 0% it's all the way, but what I want to do is just soften that up until I like it, just to visual taste somewhere around 40 or 45%. Now that I like that, that effect, what I'm going to do is just duplicate this layer and just go ahead and merge that down. So we have basically our adjusted raw, which was, we'll just call it the ACR filter. Now that we have that done, let's go ahead and take it to the next step. I'm not going to go too much into, we could add some pro contrast and tonal contrast. The problem with the night sky images overall is that the more we do to them, the more contrast we add, the more, especially tonal contrast, detail extraction, all those things that we usually do to our images to give them that extra pop and make them look very crisp, sharpening, all that stuff, it's going to accentuate the noise. And as you can see here, our noise is already pretty much off the chart. So we have to be very careful about that. So what we're actually going to do as a first step is we're going to try to mitigate some of that noise. And I'm going to do that here is actually one of my favorite ways to mitigate and remove noise is actually using Nick Collection Define. So we're going to go ahead and load Define. So you can see it actually loaded pretty quickly this time, which is nice. And we have basically our default result looks pretty good. Here's something to point out. By default, these programs, no matter which noise reduction software you use, they all use different algorithms and they do their best. They really do their best to figure out what is texture, what's detail, what's actually geometry, and what is, in this case, sky. But you can see that the more we soften this, the more it's going to kind of get rid of some of these faint stars in the background. So we have to figure out, you know, how much do we give and how much do we take. So around here, the default result for the sky usually works pretty good. And what I usually do, remember I usually take a manual adjustment here and I select a region. Well, the problem is it's going to probably soften these areas that I select. So I'm going to go with the regular one. But what I'm going to do is just change it under reduce here. Instead of contrast noise, and most of this is contrast noise at 100%, I'm going to change that to 150. So I'm going to make it a little bit more dramatic and pronounced. Now you can see we're getting rid of a lot of that noise there. Might be a little bit too much. Let's split the difference at 125. And we'll apply this. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at our effect here overall. Looks pretty good. Let's zoom in so we can kind of see what's happening here. Now the sky's starting to look good, starting to look really soft. Still getting the nice colors of the Milky Way here and everything else, but I'm also starting to lose some of the details from the tree. So you can see there's less noise here on the horizon than there is in the sky, and I'm losing all that crisp detail in the tree. So what I'm going to do is about the same thing that I did with the other layer, add a mask, use the gradient tool here to draw the effect of this down to about the top of the tree and the horizon itself. And it's the same thing that I'm going to do here is change the density. So I'll say 50% knockout here, maybe even 60% knockout. 60 or even 70. And that way I'm still going to get some of the softening over the trees, but it's not going to be as much or as intense as it was before. So fully intense here, semi-opaque here, and then we get a nice softer sky. So it looks much better overall than it did before. We lost some of the stars, but it still looks pretty good. So far so good. We've gone from a original dark, boring looking raw to something that's a little bit more bright and vibrant. So now I'm going to do a couple different things before we call it quits on this image and move on to something a little bit more challenging. First thing I'm going to do is show you guys how to accentuate the Milky Way. Now this is part of the Milky Way. We're not seeing too much of the galactic core here, but you can definitely tell that there's something going on here. Depending on the time of the year that changes, but right now we can still get some enhancement out of it. Let's go ahead and create a curves layer, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to ramp the curves up. But while I ramp the curves up, I'm actually going to lock in the shadows. So I want to keep the shadows intact, and while I keep these shadows mostly intact, I'm just going to start to ramp this up. And you can see as I do that, it's going to increase the contrast in the night sky, which looks pretty good. So I'm going to find sort of a happy balance of this. That looks pretty good. And I'll also find a good balance of where to lock this down as well. And I'm going to go ahead and flood the background with black. And what we're going to do here is using the brush, we're actually going to just start painting in parts of these areas that we want to enhance in the sky. So for here, I don't want to enhance everything, I only want to enhance some of those areas there. The other thing that I can do after I get this area exactly how I want it, I can also add some contrast. So we'll say brightness and contrast. We'll go contrast just like this, and just a little bit of brightness to knock it out. And what I'm actually going to do is ramp this a little bit. Now, I don't do this for very many images, but what I'm actually going to do is ramp it so that we get a little bit of darkness in the sky. So we'll just go white to black from the top to about here so that we can actually get a nice ramp of darkness here for the sky. And that's going to add contrast. So I'll go all the way from the top all the way down to the bottom, and you can see that I can change this. And now I can get some more contrast in the sky. And that looks pretty good at 30. And we'll go ahead and take a look at our color corrections here. So here now you can see we pop that detail out of the sky and it looks pretty good. So now if we take a look at everything that we've done, and again this is just a basic example of how we're going to be editing and getting the most kick or punch or whatever you want to call it out of the Milky Way or out of the stars. And it's nice, it's a very similar technique to what we've been doing before, but we're dealing with much more noise overall. So it's something we're always going to have to be careful of, is pushing things at higher ISO too far. Because if you push them too far, then they're going to look broken, it's going to accentuate the noise. So we have to do our best with what we have and make use of the softer adjustments that we have to push it in little increments rather than in large steps. So let's take a look. We have our final after, we have our original before, again the final after again, and again it's starting to look really good. That wraps up this lesson. Again, it's very basic. We just pointed the camera at the night sky, didn't think too much about it, talked a little bit about camera settings, focus. Now it's time to do something a little bit more challenging. We actually go camp out at the base of Mount Cook at Hooker Lake and try to do something a little bit more interesting with the night sky.